Hey Wargamers, today Games Workshop released a preview of the new Railgun rules that will be featured in the upcoming Tau Empire Codex, and I gotta say, they are pretty wild. So, if you don't know, the Railgun is one of the two main weapon choices you can take on the Hammerhead gunship, the signature tank of the Tau Empire. You can either choose a railgun or an ion cannon, and that railgun is really an iconic weapon. In the lore, it has a really strong background of being just incredibly powerful, just like ripping through tanks. And on the tabletop, it hasn't quite lived up to that reputation. So at certain times in history, it's been pretty powerful. Most recently, it's been notably not powerful at all. And these new rules really bring it back into alignment with that lore of just being a extremely formidable weapon. So the new rules here are range 72, heavy 1. That's not changed, but what has changed is its strength 14, AP -6, and damage D3 +6. And it has the ability that each time an attack is made with this weapon, invulnerable saving throws cannot be made against that attack. Each time a successful wound roll is made for an attack with this weapon, the target suffers 3 mortal wounds in addition to any other damage. So massive amounts of damage. And what this means is that if the railgun hits, it's probably going to wound, right? It's wounding most things on a 2-up. Things that are toughness 8 or higher, yeah, you're getting a 3-up, but still, you are very likely to wound. It virtually ignores all armor saves. You have to do some shenanigans in order to actually get an armor save against this AP -6. And then it ignores invulnerable saves flat out. So you basically don't get saves against this. It might as well say no saves of any kind allowed. You have to rely on mechanics like Feel No Pain or some special rules like the special rules for the Satan or Gazgul that limit the number of wounds that you can do to them, right? It has to be something like that in order to not take just tremendous damage from this. So it is going to do a lot of damage if it hits. It also has a vastly improved mortal wound mechanic compared to its previous iteration, right? Like the previous iteration, the mortal wounds were dependent on a dice roll. And here it's just, if you wound, you do 3 mortal wounds, which is just a massive improvement in terms of reliability and output, which ultimately means that if a railgun successfully hits a target, it is doing a minimum of 10 damage. 10 damage from a single shot, just as a minimum, which is wild. So there's 3 mortal wounds there, right? Which we get just from wounding the thing. And then the D3 +6 means that you get 7 to 9 damage just off of that hit as part of the damage roll. And I think that's important to pick out. I think the first couple times I read this, I read it as D6 +3. I kind of transposed those two numbers. But no, it's D3 +6. So you will always do at least 7 damage plus 3 mortal wounds with this, possibly up to 9 damage plus 3 mortal wounds, so 12 damage total. And those mortal wounds, of course, transfer over, right? So if you are firing against a big monster or a vehicle, you might not kill it. It might still survive. But if you're firing against a smaller monster or a lighter vehicle, you can just wipe it right off the tabletop. For units that contain multiple models, you're still getting a fair amount of damage on this because of those mortal wounds, right? Because they can transfer, those mortal wounds will spill over into other models. So a unit of 3 wound models, let's say we're looking at crisis suits or destroyers or something like that, you're going to still take 2 of those models off with a single railgun shot. If we're talking about a bunch of 1 wound models like Necron warriors or fire warriors or guardians or orcs, whatever you want, most infantry, we're looking at 4 models from a single shot, which is a little sneaky, right? Like we get the 1 model removed from the standard damage and then the 3 models removed from the mortal wounds, which normally would just be 1. You would think that 1 shot is 1 kill, but the rules here are such that you actually do get a fair amount of spread in those multi-model units, which is pretty cool. It offers a lot of utility, even if it's not the most efficient thing, right? Like we're firing this one gun at a unit of, let's say 5 guys. It's not necessarily the best way to get rid of those 5 guys, but it will work. It will do the job because of these really impressive abilities and stat lines associated with the new railgun. It's just insane how much damage this thing can do. Of course, in order to do any of those things, you need to hit first, right? Like it's a single shot weapon. You need to make that hit. And because it's a single shot weapon, missing carries a huge opportunity cost, right? There's a potential 10 damage at least that you're doing on this target. And so you really need to make that hit land. You don't have the opportunity to kind of mitigate your losses through volume of fire or anything like that. It's a binary outcome. Either you hit or you miss. And if you miss, you get nothing. So you have to hit. Hammerheads right now are at a 3-up ballistic skill. I don't expect that to change. And so that means that there is a 1/3 chance that you're going to miss with your super awesome, super sexy new railgun. So you need to change that, because having a 1/3 chance of just totally whiffing is not acceptable for such a high priority weapon. You need to make it land. And so we need to think about ways that we could potentially augment the ballistic skill of Hammerheads. Historically, this has been done through Long Strike, which improves the ballistic skill, or effectively improves the ballistic skill of nearby Hammerheads. He's a Tau Sep character, and we haven't seen anything about him in this preview, which is a little weird, considering that this preview is essentially the Hammerhead preview. You would think that they might mention what Long Strike does, but they don't. And either that means he's staying exactly the same, or that he's changing in a way that doesn't really come into play in this context. Or it's a short preview. Maybe they just wanted to not put the effort in. I don't know. But yeah, like what about Long Strike? Is he going to, give us the same type of improved reliability that we had before? Maybe. We'll have to wait and find out. But in this preview, they do give us a little bit better option here, a more universal option, right? Long Strike being Tau Sept lock is, restricted in its application. But instead, they gave us the targeting array special rule. So Hammerheads now have this special rule called targeting array, which says each time this unit's Hammerhead model is selected to shoot, you can reroll 1 hit roll when resolving its attack. So you get to reroll a single hit roll. You can't reroll all of them. You can't reroll a subset of them. It's just 1. And clearly, if you're bringing a railgun, this is awesome for you, because if you miss with the railgun, you're going to use your reroll on that. Right? So you need to have it for the railgun, but it's still useful for your other weapons too, in case you hit with your railgun, right? If you take the 67% chance of hitting and you do it, you can use this for something else, right? If you're bringing smart missile systems, you can use that on one of those. Or if you're not even bringing a railgun, if you're bringing an ion cannon, for example, this is still useful there, right? So a really awesome rule that really does add a fair amount of reliability to the railgun shot, or in general, the Hammerhead weaponry. You're able to, take that 3-up ballistic skill, and then you're re-rolling to hit with 2/3 of those on average, right? You're still getting that improved outcome, even though you're not directly augmenting the ballistic skill beyond a 3. So it's still very, very good, very reliable because of the targeting array. This is also a little reminiscent of some of the old vehicle support systems. You used to be able to take support systems on vehicles just like you could battlesuits, but since 8th edition came around, that wasn't the case anymore. You can't do that. And that really made vehicles feel boring, really dull, right? Like they were guns with wheels, and that was it. Or rather not wheels, but I guess jetpacks, thrusters, whatever you want to think about it as. They were guns on cars, and that's not exciting. That's not fun. Having these types of support systems reintroduced in the form of special rules adds that flavor back in. It adds that utility. It makes each of those vehicles a little different, perhaps, in a way that they weren't before. And I really appreciate that. And it does it in a restricted way that doesn't necessarily cause the same opportunities for exploitation or balance challenges that would have come in if they would have introduced support systems back in wholesale, right? In the same way that you can take them as upgrades and pick and choose and that sort of thing. So I'm fine with this. I'm happy that they have this. It's certainly better than nothing. And I think it actually is a much better version of the Hammerhead because of its inclusion. So happy to see the targeting array. They also mentioned in the preview that Hammerheads will work really well with marker lights, which is interesting. I think we generally assume that most units would work well with marker lights, but they selected the Hammerhead with its targeting array as being a particular example of benefiting from the marker lights. And that's interesting in the way that it probably means that marker lights and the targeting array would be offer different benefits, right? And so that's not true with the current setup for marker lights, right? The current set for marker lights would be largely redundant, at least in a few of the cases with the targeting array. And so I think perhaps this suggests that the ability to reroll misses is no longer a benefit of the marker light system. And it probably also suggests, as a consequence, a simplified benefit structure, right? Maybe marker lights just give us +1 ballistic skill. Maybe they just remove cover or something like that. I don't know. We'll have to wait and find out. This is one of the big questions that we have about the Codex that still hasn't been answered, is what will marker lights do? And they're teasing us here. They're like, we're going to mention it, but we're not going to actually tell you anything. So really excited to see how marker lights work. And again, also still waiting to see how saber protocols work. They've teased both of these things in the past couple previews, and they haven't given us an answer yet. So we have to look forward to those previews, hopefully sometime soon. We also learned that submunitions are now a stratagem. So in the past, you used to be able to choose the mode of fire for your railguns, either selecting the solid shot, which is the version of the gun in the preview here, or using submunitions, which when blast templates were a thing, it was a blast template. Otherwise, in 8th edition forward, it was a multi-shot weapon. And you could choose between those two as the game went on, depending on what you were firing at. That's no longer the case. Now, railgun is one thing, but they have given us the submunitions stratagem in order to allow for that same or similar functionality in a different context. So the stratagem says, use this stratagem in your shooting phase when a hammerhead model from your army is selected to shoot. If that model is equipped with a railgun, instead of making attacks with that weapon this phase, select one enemy unit that is not within engagement range of any units from your army and is within 36 inches of and visible to that model. Roll 1d6 for each model in that unit, adding 1 to each roll if that unit has 11 or more models. For each 4-up, that unit suffers 1 mortal wound to a maximum of 8 mortal wounds. And so that is pretty good. It's not a bad stratagem for 1 CP. The thresholding on this is a little interesting. So for 10 or fewer models, you're needing 4. So for a unit of 10, you're going to get 5 mortal wounds on average. But on 11 or higher, you need 3s to wound, or to get the mortal wound. And so on a unit of 12, you're actually saturating that 8 mortal wound limit on average, right? 2/3 of 12 is 8. So you're maximizing on average your mortal wounds with a unit of 12. So firing at larger units really just increases your propensity to achieve that statistical average, because dice are variable. You're reducing the risk by firing at a larger model count unit, but it's not necessarily going to get you more wounds on average doing that. Overall, though, I think that this stratagem is a net win, right? Like, you're giving up a little bit of flexibility, right? It's a stratagem. You can only use it on one model per phase because it's a stratagem. You have to spend CP to do it, but you're gaining so much, right? You're gaining a much better version of submunitions. This is way better than the old version. You have a way better version of the standard solid shot railgun, and so this is awesome, right? These are both very good options. If you're looking at firing at a really big unit, like 20-30 models, you're not gaining any more mortal wounds, but you probably have better options for dealing with those anyway, right? If you're looking at a 20-30 model unit, probably fire warriors are going to be the better way to deal with that, or maybe some, like flamer crisis suits or something like that, right? Like, you have better options. You shouldn't be firing your hammerhead at a unit of 30 whatevers. So that's not actually really a big deal at all. Both of these options are really effective at their given targets, but it's a little less flexible. And that's fine with me. But even for those smaller units that you want to have mortal wounds against, it seems like Hammerheads are really going to be the way to go, right? Whether you're using the solid shot or the stratagem. Certainly, the alternatives that we have for mortal wound generation right now are things like the destroyer missiles, Sunshark bombers, right? And this seems like a far more reliable and more easily applied version of either of those, right? We're able to get a good number of mortal wounds from this with relatively, low risk or challenge, right? You don't have to position it in the same way they do a Sunshark bomber. It's not limited to the number of shots in the way that destroyer missiles are limited. And so this seems like Hammerheads, whether you're using the solid shot or the submunitions, are really becoming the premier choice in the Tau arsenal for mortal wound generation, which is good because it's something that's been really hard for the army since 8th edition is mortal wound generation. So I'm really happy to see this here. If we're talking about really small units, like if we're thinking about like Marines or something a little bit beefier, the solid shot still might actually be the better choice, right? Because for an 8 model unit, you're going to do 4 wounds, and like a mortal wound isn't necessarily that much different than a wound caused by the solid shot railgun, right? The solid shot railgun, if it hits, it's going to wound, right? You don't get the invulnerable save, you don't get the armor save, and those are kind of like the main things about mortal wounds aside from the ability to be transferred over. And so, an 8 model unit, you're going to get 4 mortal wounds on, but you might be just as well off, or if not better, using just the solid shot against that 8 or fewer model unit. It's really that 8 to 12 or higher range that you want to be considering the submunitions. All right, so if you're like me, you're probably thinking at this point, yeah, Hammerheads are probably going to be pretty good, right? Like Railguns look strong on their own, submunitions seem good too, and so overall we're seeing them as a pretty reliable source of mortal wound generation. And that's true, at least on paper, right? That Hammerheads probably will have a role in the Codex, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're overpowered or a symptom of Codex creep or anything like that. GW puts up the preview and immediately there are people, willing to throw their hands up and, stand on a soapbox about it. It's not necessarily that extreme, right? It's not necessarily that. It certainly could be, but we don't know, right? The overall utility of railguns and Hammerheads in general is unclear. We don't know at this point. For one thing, it's totally dependent on the meta and the matchup, right? Like this version of the railgun, this version of the Hammerhead probably isn't going to be super useful against horde armies. And so if that's the meta, if that's who you're playing against, maybe bringing a railgun Hammerhead is going to be a little bit of a misstep. But the more important issue, I think, the more general issue, is that Hammerheads are pretty easy to kill. Right? They're not super durable. They don't have an invulnerable save or anything like that. They don't have anything to make them harder to hit. If you shoot them, they'll go down, and that's the end of the story. So yes, they might do a lot of damage against a select number of targets while they're on the board, but that's a problem that you as the person facing Tau can solve pretty easily in most cases. And so they could be strong, but they're also kind of a glass cannon in some ways. So, if you as a person playing against Tau are prioritizing removing Hammerheads, that's something that you can overcome. For a person playing Tau, maybe that means that you need to be very selective in your deployment, right? You have to keep your Hammerheads back far away using that extended range. You have to keep them on reserve, for example. Maybe Hammerheads are something you keep off the board turn 1. Maybe you put them in reserve and then bring them on turn 2 in order to deliver those solid shots when and where you need them. But then expect them to die pretty quickly after, right? Like these are ways that we can kind of play cat and mouse with Hammerheads, acknowledging that yes, they are strong, but they also can be removed pretty easily. And so there are considerations on both sides of the table about how to deal with that. That can be important balancing factors against the strength of its weapons. Additionally, there's points, right? If a Hammerhead costs 2,000 points, it's awful, right? Obviously, it's not going to cost 2,000 points, but the points cost is an important part of the story. We don't have any information on that right now. And so the points cost can balance out the offensive output and the durability in a way that brings it in line with the rest of the Codex and with other codices. So that points cost is going to be a really big regulating factor in how OP or underpowered the Hammerhead actually is. Right? So we have to wait to see what the point cost is before we make any conclusions about how good the Hammerhead is. This also raises questions about other rail weapons, though, right? Hammerheads are not the only things that have rail weapons, and perhaps these other units are going to be even better, right? Because of the way that they work. Or maybe they're going to be, horseshit, I don't know. But they will probably have the same mechanics in terms of dealing mortal wounds, having a floor of damage, right? In the case of the Hammerhead railgun, that floor is 7. Probably not going to see that's high of a floor in a lot of the other versions of rail weaponry, right? It's probably going to be a lower floor. So they're probably going to do fewer mortal wounds, have a lower damage floor, but still, like, that can be really reliable, especially in different platforms where they're going to benefit from different types of rules. So thinking about Pathfinders with rail rifles or broadsides with heavy rail rifles, those are two places that I'm really excited to see how these rail rules manifest, because they could be really interesting. Finally, in the preview, they mentioned that this railgun is not the strongest weapon in the Codex. And that probably means that the options on the Storm Surge are going to be stronger, right? Like, that's kind of the next step up. You could also maybe think the Ion Accelerator on the Riptide is going to be really powerful. It probably is, right? It's probably going to be still really good. But I think the Storm Surge is probably where we're seeing this, super soaker weapon being deployed. But that too is still point and rules dependent, right? There could be points that are just, not justified for bringing a single weapon like that, or a single model in the case of Storm Surge. Or there could be some rules that they have that just make them unplayable, right? Like, if you have to have a Storm Surge anchored for 3 turns before you can fire the thing, and yeah, that's probably not that great. So we have to wait and see, right? We have to wait and see. But as a whole, yeah, this looks really strong. It looks really cool. I'm super excited that the railgun is getting the attention it deserves. It has rules that fit the way that it should feel to fire that thing, right? And these are rules. This is a weapon that could make a huge difference in the way that Tau play. And it'll be interesting to see how Hammerheads as a whole intersect with some of these other themes that we're seeing put forward, right? Like, if you asked me last week, I'd say, oh, well, my army's probably going to be battlesuits and infantry, probably nothing to do with Hammerheads. But now it's like, well, maybe Hammerheads are going to be the way to go. And so we'll see what the Codex brings, of course. But I'm excited that there are multiple elements, multiple themes with the army that suggest that there's multiple ways to build it. And that's really the most important thing, right? You don't want a Codex to come out that says, okay, here's one way to build an army. Everything else sucks. You have to build it this one way. That's not what it looks like so far, right? With these previews, is that it seems like there's flexibility. It seems like there's multiple ways that you could play this army effectively. And I'm eager to see what comes next. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you excited about this? Do you think it's totally ridiculous? Do you think it's fair and balanced? Let me know. We can have a discussion on the topic in the comments section. But as always, thanks for watching and happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. A while ago I made my own miniature, and if you too want to be the proud owner of an Invasive Wargaming model, you can check out the link in the description below. Down there you will also find links for the Invasive Wargaming Discord server and the Invasive Wargaming Patreon. Really, this channel wouldn't be possible without the support of my patrons. Special thanks to Marcy, A Little Pink Monster, Bennaby Jones, Durza, Ever Keller, Robbie Goodwin, Jose Gomez, Ruger, Drew Pratley, Michael Byrne, Zealous Brimstone, Scott Heater, Stephen Cowan, Jared Egler, Chris Kessler, and Tao Oswell.